Hey, what's up, viewer? This is day 5, hour 3 of the Nebulous live creation series. And the last two videos I did had my microphone accidentally muted throughout both of them, so they were both no audio. So this is actually the first video with audio today that I've managed to record. Alright, I am going to jump right into it here. I'm going to change a few things in the UI builder cosmetically, and essentially I want to change this text value to be centered and be bigger than this. So we're going to do something like this, bump it up to 18, bold, make sure it's all the way white. I'm going to do the same thing for this particular value. And these other two values, which appear to be colored incorrectly, or at least this one was a little too dark. Okay, so let's, and this doesn't have a scan option like that, but it's weird how that one is so much brighter than this one. Okay, let me bold it. It's kind of weird they didn't bold. Alright. Let's take a quick look at this. And for placeholder's sake, it's a little bit more clear what I'm going for with these named like this. Alright, and then next we need to do the infrastructure options in the active selection window. So I liked economy being that size and being that color. It can be bolded, I suppose, and it needs to be centered. But it's going to have to get centered through its element is going to have to center it. Okay. So we'll center these also. I have to change the name of this one to, let's see, what was this, 18 or 12? 12. Say scan range. This one is scan frequency, and we'll put it like this since it's a tad larger. And I'm just going to bold them. And then down here we'll need a label. Okay, value row 2. Toss a label in. And we're back to this issue where it's got to have its size equalized. So instead we could just yank the second row and the third row and duplicate the first row. And rename these for some organization. And now we have all the sizes correct and all the labels correct outside of the labels, the actual words in the labels. So I'm going to run through here and take a look at what these are called. Okay, so this one is, for now it's a research element. And I'll call it research. And this one we should probably call orbital build. How does that sound? Whoops, and that's... Okay, that's the wrong spot for this anyway. Or accidentally put the space in there, I suppose. All right, and what was the like number 6 beyond this? Surface defense value. I think for now I'm going to stick with these first 5 that I've got. So I'm going to come here and essentially change the label to 3 question marks, because I don't know what these are going to be yet. I'll call this open element. Or I would if it would allow me to, whoops, that wasn't what I wanted. I am trying to change this. Okay. Just call it row 2 open element, and then now we got the 3rd rows of values, and it's basically the same thing here. I'm not sure what these are going to be yet. Row 3 open element 1. The attack and defense values make some sense. And we will say this as well. So now we've got the functional values, and we can even more or less lower the opacity on the ones that aren't even active by default as a symbolism, more or less. Alrighty, so alright, so now what we need to do is add a, I suppose the player is going to be able to okay, so the player is going to be able to add the element or remove the element from investment, are basically the 2 options. And then there's also going to be a output for the value, for the number value of whatever the active selection is. I'm also considering making it to where a brand new active selection may have none of these, and if it's got none of them, they essentially have to be grayed out, but there is a button for initial investment. And then once the initial investment kicks in, then it can then the player is able to invest in the efficiency of that economy, or in the efficiency of that infrastructure. But that's a slight nuance, so I'm not sure if I'm going to do that or not just quite yet. Okay, so we are going to add to this element a text element. Oh, and I did use an element for that. Or wait, this is economy element. Yeah, okay, so if I drop this in here, or no, excuse me, a label. I need to drop another label in here. So I drop this in there. It can represent a value. And there actually needs to be a group of buttons for clearing or basically says clear. Clear and invest, perhaps. Like this. And this would make it very easy to just come over here and click the button to start increasing the economy. And this would allow you to remove the economy as your target of investment. And that wasn't exactly my plan. My exact plan was to actually have some kind of plus button and minus button on either side of this number. And clicking the button would begin investing, essentially. And the other click would clear it. So it effectively becomes these two buttons. And I can even communicate that by perhaps having a circle. And let's see if this looks any good, having an arrow. That was kind of how I was imagining it, but this is more straightforward, I suppose. Alright, and this element is top aligning, but I kind of want to see what it looks like if I center it. Maybe. And if I space it, do a space around on it, that's probably the best one. I can even punch up the size by a little bit. However, it'd be cool to scan, to color code these, probably. And I'm also seeing, like, the background of this being white, and the text actually being black. And I might pad the text by, let me just say raw 1%. Maybe. The text still seems a little small. I'll go up to 14 and bold, and I'll center it. And that effectively works. The colors need to be a little different, I suppose. And find some better names for these, probably. And the idea would be that they... So basically what I can do is I can more or less perfect one of these, and then it will just expand into these other ones, I'm pretty sure. So I'm getting a little picky on the design of these elements because just for verbosity and then just for clarity. But I kind of see where I'm going with this, like making these opacity also and just practice the economy one. And maybe copy the economy one into the other ones. So let's see here if I can... Let's see what I can do for this. Okay, so let me jump here. The economy element... Economy element title. I spelled it wrong. And economy element... I guess I just had an idea. I'm just going to call this title because it's reproducible, which means I should be able to... Well, if I name it specifically, I don't have to branch it in the code. So I'm not really sure actually which one of these is a better option. So I'm just going to stick with this. Economy element value. And then this is... I'll just call this economy investment buttons. And the first button is the clear button. Clear economy investment button. And clear... So the problem with this is once I reproduce it, I'll have to rename everything. But I'd have to rename it anyway if it was a template, I suppose. So clear economy, where was I? Clear economy investment button. Invest economy investment button. Alright, so that's everything for this panel. And there's also the economy element. I'm going to change this as well to say active selection economy element. Whoops. That is not correct. Okay. Economy element. Active selection economy element. Alright, so that's everything named within these first elements. So now we need to do a few things. And that first thing is going to be this, actually. We're going to go here and change the opacity on these to 65. Just so there's some consistency. With this next mechanic, which is to and it's set enabled, I do believe. So even though this is opacity is changed, it's still interactable, if I'm not mistaken. However, the idea would be that this is how it looks when most of the looks like the buttons are overflowing. They are, but they're still usable, which is incorrect. They need to do this where they're actually deactivated. So that's doable. Let's fix these buttons though. And to do that, in here we need to figure out why they are overflowing their container. So I suppose the easy thing would just be to do a size a manual size setup here. Okay, so it is actually taking up its parent size. So we can set that to 35%. Same thing, we'll set it to 35%. And unfortunately, though, they aren't centering properly. Now they are. And perhaps the sort of the symbolism was nifty because I could make the text size a little different. It's not padding much around the words. Let's see if that fixes it in the other build though. Alright, so it looks a little better. I guess that's workable. It's weird how it is. It's just strange how it's different between the UI builder and the real thing. It's just a little weird, but that's better that it's not overflowing. So now I need to, upon selecting this, put this number, put its economy value here. Is basically what needs to happen. So now we're busting back into our good old player's active selection. Player clicks selection button code. I'm going to close everything else here. And we are going to okay, so this is giving me an idea to make separate components for all of the economy values. But I like the idea of what I was doing, where I was, instead of a scanning capacity, oh, but scanning capacity is still required for the arc. Well, I guess it isn't really. The arc exists in its own space, so maybe I could pull it off where I do something like this instead, where I say, what was it, celestial infrastructure. Called celestial infrastructure. And it's the active selection. The active selection has to have celestial infrastructure. And there's a way to break this up a little bit, but I'm just going to go with this. So now I'm going to grab the scanning capacity and switch it with celestial infrastructure. For just those positions there, so and sometimes it's done in the wrong spot. Take this out of there. Now we've got celestial infrastructure does in fact have a scan range value. These are still the same. Thing down in here, we're doing the radius. Excuse me. Scan range and scan frequency. So that should actually The only thing we have to change now is assigning the celestial infrastructure upon instantiation, which is done in our spawn celestial bodies code. So here, this essentially is the same thing. We have to say celestial infrastructure equals, and we say new celestial, add component, and we add the celestial infrastructure component. I was considering it. I don't remember using max scanning arc. That's something I could add eventually, but for now we're just assuming they can go up to 360 degrees, but that could change later. But for now, I'm actually going to move this down here and comment these out for a moment. And then here we're going to have to set celestial infrastructure to its scan range, or its scan radius, for instance, equal to capital max scanning radius. And we're essentially just setting these values. Oh, this is an integer, so it's going to be annoyed that... Oh, wait a minute, hold on. Yeah, this gives us back a celestial infrastructure. Oh, it's not scan radius, it's scan range. And now it's this float plugging into an integer. So I need to peek this with Alt F9? Alt F12. I thought it was Alt F12. It was, okay. We're just going to change... What was I... Oh, okay, so we're going to come in here and change these to floats. And this little sign now. And same thing. Capital max scanning frequency. And then celestial infrastructure also has an economy value, which is going to be equal to capital starting economy. And we'll set it up as a public value so we can, whoops, so we can expose it in the editor and tweak it from there. And we're going to leave the arc to 360 as a default value. I have to see if that breaks, and I'll have to change something else somewhere else if it does. But so for now, and then if it does have celestial infrastructure, then okay, so it's starting to get into a few different branches here. The scanning elements. So since we're checking for celestial infrastructure, if the selection has celestial infrastructure, I am actually going to want to I could feasibly open the I could actually force the active selection window to open for the player. in the event they do select. That might be interesting. And they need to okay, so we're going to need a visual element for the active selection economy element, I do believe. I'll have to double check here in the builder. But this whole contraption is the active selection economy element. Okay. And that's what we need to change a few things about at start. Equals root query for a visual element. And I named it correctly. Active selection economy element. And from here we're going to say oh, and this is on wait, hold on, this is on selection. Yeah, so on selection, active selection economy element dot set enabled has to equal true. And active selection economy element, oh, I actually have to do a label. Active selection economy value. Economy element value. Economy element value. So now we're querying for this label. Economy element value. Alright, and then we have to take the active selection economy, or actually we're going to change the name of it to match. So economy element value. And we have to of course take that and set its text to celestial infrastructure dot economy to a string. And we may also change it to a integer value. Because the decimal points will flood the size pretty quickly. So I may in fact do a mathf dot round to int. And that's not correct either because it might give a value that's too low or too high, basically. So the idea would be that it can only ever increase by a. It's gonna be able to increase by a float every once in a while. If it's high enough that it would be irrelevant what the floating point value is. Might make a difference, but if I could just format it to like 2 decimal places, it would probably not break anything. It's cleaner though as an integer. So I suppose the best way would still be to say mathf ceiling to int. To string. And that should in fact activate our element with the economy value. And the economy one turns on by default no matter what, I suppose. And hold on, this is I may wind up caching this root value. Although it might not be a big deal. Okay, so if we click on it, it should set it up to our value and unlock it for clicking. And if we deselect, then it needs to actually flip-flop this. So let's come here and do this, and then it can't invest in an economy. And the economy text is just all the zeros, I guess. And then I also need to do this part down here. In the event the player selects nothing, they need to also make sure that the element disables. They're going to have to wind up disabling. Well, actually, in this instance, I could actually just disable the entire values elements element. Change this name to active selection infrastructure values elements, which is huge, but it's active selection infrastructure values element. I could just deactivate this whole thing basically. Would be the idea if there's no celestial capacity at all. So let's see if I can pull this off. Active selection infrastructure values element. All right, and this element, so the entire element is non-workable. It doesn't have a label, a specific label, but it can set the label to 0 anyways. And it would have to set the I named it this. And I think we can say style dot capacity equals 0.65 float, which is a hard-coded value that we've devised. And we can still do this here where the label gets reset. Okay, so let's see if this works. And this works. Oh, you know what? Now that I'm changing the opacity, if it is a successful selection, and to determine a successful selection, it doesn't matter if it has celestial infrastructure, it will turn on the economy one. So it needs to turn on, but it also needs to say style.opacity equals 1 float. And then the text needs equal to its economy value. So now if the game starts, there's no active selection, and the entire panel is deactivated. If I select the selection, it should tell me some values. Okay, so it said 0, but it did turn on, and if I leave this, it turned off. And now it's not turning back on. Okay, so I messed that up somehow. And I suppose the reason for that is because I'm going to have to actually do this part. In the event I select a active selection celestial body, but it needs to be true, and the opacity needs to go to 1, and the underlying panels need to select their own opacities to follow suit. And now if I jump in here, I should be able to retain the active ability of the economy tally. So now it's dark. If I leave it, it's not. If I come back, it's dark. I click the buttons. Oh, that was weird. So I'm gonna have to do that mouse thing again for down here, basically. But if it deselects, then it's no longer interactable. And if I select something else but that it isn't interactable economically, that actually did not work correctly. And I suppose that's because in the else block here I forgot to set the opacity. Style to 0.65. Alright, so now it's going to swap everything correct, except the issue seems to be that the mouse needs to know when I'm clicking over it. Similar to how it knows it's entering this UI. Or it should just know anyway, if I'm not mistaken. Oops, I did maximize. It's not going to actually let me look at that. So let me enter this normally and enter play mode. I'll take a look and let's see. So it doesn't realize that this is over the UI, but it does realize this is over the UI. It doesn't realize this is over the UI. Okay, so I can basically add the two side panels to it, I believe. If I can remember which script it was in. Oh, and this was using the mouse? No, it doesn't look like it. Because I just have to do this with the other two elements. And they will not break when I click on them. So let's take a look. Mouse transitions UI surface. Oh, and I guess probably I could just add them in here, couldn't I? I don't have to make any scripts. And instead of main UI, this one is active selection UI. Oops, hold on. And I guess this is for the same one. And this was research UI. And I might as well. Oops, sure, that's too far. I might as well grab these two and say research UI. But now let's check what they're named. Give it a second here to compile. Jump into the UI builder and take a look at what these elements are called. I believe this whole thing here is just called a active selection information, active selection readout. So the whole thing is the active selection readout. So for now, let's do that. Oops. So this is active selection readout. And the other one was active research readout. Alright, and this is going to toggle the ability of the user to deselect the active selection if it's over a UI element for both of these panels. So now if we leave the UI builder and we take another look at the game view and probably maximize it again and take a look here, I should be able to go click the buttons when active selection is selected. So I select this. If I go over here and click these buttons, okay, good. So now it's not breaking. If I leave it, you can't click them. If I deselect completely, you can't click them. It is kind of interesting how it is double breaking the opacity. Because the sun can't do anything, so it shouldn't be broken. So I'm thinking essentially of doing it a little differently in here, where okay, so it's actually kind of what I'm feeling like is the panel defaulting the whole panel off isn't actually a good idea, it looks like. Because it's going to mess with the overall color of the elements. So upon selection, I don't actually want to actually want to do this part. Instead, I'm just going to have to manually revert to the economy elements. Like this. And I already had it there anyway. And then in the event selection occurs, then, or if in the event the selection has celestial economy capability, it will turn on the opacity and set the value. And celestial infrastructure's economy needs to be set in here by capital starting economy, which actually needs to match with player data's I guess it doesn't have one. So it's on the spawner. It's just right here. Alright, so this is going to determine what the capital starts with. Which will be, let's just set it to set it to 5. But that also means that player data, let me see, player data that means iterate player economy has to essentially needs to increase its gain per tick value. So therefore it's like you might as well just put the capital starting value in here as opposed to on this. So you don't have to make this assignment. Or you do have to make that. I guess you do have to make this assignment, but you don't have to. I'm actually not sure what I mean. Alright, so on start, the economy. Okay, so essentially the iterate player economy per tick should just act off of it should act off a player data value, because then other things can change that tick value. And other things economy value is what changes the tick value. So we'll call this total economy gain per tick. And the other one was seconds per tick, basically. And then that means that in here we're going to replace these two values. So this is total economy gain per tick. And this will remove the need for this particular value. And then the tick rate winds up being the same thing as the player data value. So player data dot I thought it was like seconds per tick, which means you can get down to like half a second. But that should actually keep that working like it's supposed to. As long as I make sure that I set the player data values. Oh, and they don't get set here actually. Those get changed as the player makes decisions in the game space. Okay, so was it this then? So the starting capital economy I've picked as 5. And I'm going to start the max frequency as 2, and I'm going to start the max radius as I'll make it 5. So I'll tick 5 per second. And that should set the initial economy infrastructure value, and it should change how quickly the economy gains value. So let's see what it does. And it should give me the ability to place the economy value into the UI properly. Okay, so I missed something. That's correct now, but I missed something else. So the value is not updating correctly. Oh, so seconds per tick has to have a default value of 1. And total economy gain per tick, I'm actually going to check the inspector this time, and I think it'll turn to 5. Excuse me. And it should properly tick now since I set seconds per tick. And total economy gain is not setting correctly. So, total economy gain per tick needs to set just essentially as soon as it spawns here. I'd say player data dot total economy gain per tick, and this is the only thing that assigns it to the capital starting economy. And from this point, everything else can just all it has to do is change the total economy gain per tick player data value, and it can also change what the player's economy gain is. Same thing if it loses it. Alright, so that should fix that problem. And, alright, so we've got the ticking economy per second. If I select this option, we have the economy window showing up, not investable, but showing up. And the next thing we would need to do is actually, oh, and it properly set the scanner up to work in these ranges. So if I set the scan out, I'm going to just double check that everything is still working here. And if I make it an orange one, it is scanning out. Okay. So I've got the scan going. And, okay, so once again, if I deselect this then, it turns it off and it doesn't jank it. Okay. So now I just need to, for the capital plan at least, set up these two at least, and then consider these also. I'm gonna need these to do these other ones. But you get it to the point where if I invest in this, it starts increasing my tick every time. And then same thing, I can invest in the scan range to make this 5 go up, and I can invest in scan frequency to make this go up. Is basically the idea. And I'm going to run it maximal to see if, oh, I'm going to start this at 0. So I'm going to run this to max to see if it will maybe give me a lucky thumbnail. See what happens. Otherwise, I'm just going to set it up to make it look like it's doing stuff. Almost too expensive. And run a scan. Alright, so that's going to be the end of this video, and I've got a lot more to go, but it is coming together. And I think this is going to be a pretty cool game, so I'm happy that if you're still here watching this, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.